A wealthy man forces his ailing daughter to clean his vast mansion daily, oblivious to her suffering. But a silent raven, a witness to his cruelty, is about to reveal the dark truth he hides. The morning sun, a pale intruder, barely managed to pierce the heavy velvet curtains of Blackwood Manor. Inside, the air was dense, laden with the scent of old wax and a melancholy that seemed to permeate every piece of Victorian furniture. Ilara, the ailing daughter, was already on her feet, though each movement was a battle against the pain nesting in her chest and the weakness that stole her strength. Her eyes, once bright, now carried the weight of sleepless nights and days of exhaustion. With a silk handkerchief pressed against her lips to muffle a dry, persistent cough, Ilara began her daily routine. The broom, which felt heavier than it should in her hands, dragged across the marble floor of the vast entrance hall. Each sweep was an effort, each step a trial. The dust, which seemed to accumulate by magic, defied her fragility. She bent down, straightened up with difficulty, and cold sweat trickled down her forehead, not from heat, but from the fever silently consuming her. Upstairs, in the opulence of his study, Arthur Blackwood was immersed in his own domains. The sound of his voice, deep and authoritative, echoed through the walls, dictating orders over the phone, trading stocks, sealing fates. To him, the manor was a symbol of his power and its impeccability, an extension of his own image. Ilara's presence, a pale spectre moving between rooms, was merely a detail, a tool to keep his physical empire in order. "Ilara, the art gallery isn't sparkling yet," he said, his voice cutting through the morning silence as he walked past her in the corridor, without even slowing his pace. His eyes, cold and distant, barely lingered on her hunched figure. "I have important guests tonight. I need everything to be impeccable before noon." Ilara merely nodded, unable to utter a word without a coughing fit overcoming her. The moisture in her eyes wasn't just from tiredness. It was the moisture of resignation, of pain that no one saw or that no one wanted to see. She dragged herself to the gallery where dozens of gilded frames awaited her touch, each a reminder of the luxury that surrounded her and the misery that consumed her. Outside, perched on the sill of one of the tall Gothic windows, the raven watched. Its black, piercing eyes, sharper than any human's, caught every nuance of the scene. It had seen Ilara's cough, the paleness of her face, the tremor in her hands as she tried to lift a heavy porcelain vase. And it had seen her father's glacial indifference, the way he walked past her as if she were just another piece of furniture to be polished. The raven, which the servants called Corvus for its constant and mysterious presence, tilted its head. It was no ordinary animal. There was a cold, calculating intelligence in its gaze, a silent loyalty that had formed over months of observation. It had witnessed Ilara's deterioration, her father's veiled cruelty, and now something stirred within it. When Arthur Blackwood, after his brief and cold interaction, turned to go back to his study, the raven acted. With a swift, almost imperceptible movement, it dropped a small object it held in its beak, a mother-of-pearl button it had found in the garden. The button fell, spinning in the air, and landed with a soft clink on the marble floor, exactly in Arthur's path. The man stopped, his eyes fixed on the small, shimmering object. He picked it up, examining it for an instant, a wrinkle of confusion on his forehead. It was a button from one of Ilara's shirts, which he vaguely recognized. Why was it there? He looked up towards the window, but the raven had already vanished, flying to the rooftop, where it observed the scene from above. Arthur shrugged, dismissing the incident as a triviality, and tossed the button into a nearby wastebasket before continuing on his way. But the raven knew it had planted a seed, a small deviation in the man's routine, a moment of crack in his indifference. It was only the beginning. The truth, Like the darkness accumulating in the manor was about to be revealed, and the raven would be its herald. Ilara, her body trembling, dragged herself to the art gallery. The air there was even heavier, imbued with the smell of old oil paint and the promise of endless work. The gilded frames which Arthur demanded shine like mirrors seemed to mock her weakness. She picked up a damp cloth and began to polish, each movement a test for her aching muscles. The cough, previously dry, now came with a wheezing in her chest, a sound she desperately tried to muffle. "Just a little more, Ilara," she murmured to herself, her voice hoarse and almost inaudible. Just a little more. But the little more seemed to stretch into infinity. Her vision blurred, and cold sweat trickled down her temples, mixing with the silent tears she wouldn't allow to fall. She leaned against a marble pedestal, closing her eyes for an instant, feeling the world spin. The image of her father, with his icy indifference, loomed in her mind. He didn't see the fever, didn't see the superhuman effort she made to fulfill his orders. He saw only the surface, the facade of an impeccable manner. Meanwhile, in his study, Arthur Blackwood was in his element. The phone was back to his ear, and his voice resonated with the confidence of a man who controlled his own universe. "Yes, the contracts will be ready for signing tonight. Make sure the champagne is the 1998 Dom Perignon. My guests expect the best." He hung up, a satisfied smile playing on his lips. The manor would be the perfect setting to seal another of his lucrative deals. He stood up, walking to the window overlooking the front garden where the raven usually perched. His eyes swept the landscape, searching for any imperfection. Outside, Corvus watched. It had seen Ilara almost faint in the gallery, seen the way she clung to the pedestal, her breath ragged. And it had seen Arthur, oblivious, absorbed in his world of power and luxury. The seed planted with the button had not germinated. Arthur had dismissed it as insignificant. The raven knew it needed something more direct, something that couldn't be so easily ignored. With a silent flight, Corvus descended from the rooftop and landed on the sill of Arthur's study window. The man had his back turned, adjusting his tie in front of a mirror. The raven waited, its eyes fixed on a small crystal vase on Arthur's desk, containing a single red rose, already somewhat wilted, perhaps one of the flowers Ilara had forgotten to change or hadn't had the strength to care for. Arthur turned, picking up some important papers. His eyes, for an instant, fell upon the wilted rose. "Ilara really needs to pay more attention to details," he grumbled, without much conviction, more from habit than genuine annoyance. He was about to pick up the papers when Corvus acted. With a swift and precise movement, the raven flew into the study, swooped past Arthur's head, and with a precise strike of its beak, knocked over the crystal vase. The vase crashed to the marble floor with a loud shatter, the wilted rose rolling away, and water spreading over Arthur's documents. Arthur Blackwood let out a cry of surprise and rage. "What in the—" he exclaimed, looking at the broken vase and the wet papers. He looked up, furious, and saw the raven flying out the window, disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. "Damn bird!" Arthur cursed, kicking a piece of crystal. He knelt, trying to salvage the documents, but the ink was already starting to smudge. Rage bubbled within him. It wasn't just the vase or the papers. It was the interruption, the audacity of that animal. Outside on the rooftop, Corvus observed the scene. Arthur was annoyed, yes, but he still hadn't grasped the message. His eyes were still blind to the truth. The raven knew it needed more. It needed a sign that would be impossible to ignore, one that would directly link the father's negligence to the daughter's suffering. The wilted rose, the wet papers, these were just echoes. The next, thought the raven, would be a scream, and it already knew exactly what it would do. The air in the art gallery, previously just heavy, had become dense and suffocating for Ilara. Each stroke of the cloth on the gilded frames was an unbearable burden. The cough, which she tried to repress with all her might, erupted in a violent and uncontrollable series. Her lungs burned, and a sharp wheeze escaped her chest with each exhalation. She bent over herself, clinging to a marble pedestal, feeling the world spin and darken. A searing pain pierced her side, and a feverish heat consumed her body. When the cough finally subsided, leaving her breathless and weak, Ilara brought her hand to her lips. On the silk handkerchief she pressed, there was a faint, almost imperceptible stain of pale red. Her eyes widened in silent panic, and she quickly folded the fabric, hiding the evidence of her deterioration. Fear, once a distant whisper, now screamed in her mind. She was getting worse, and no one seemed to notice or care. Upstairs, oblivious to his daughter's agony, Arthur Blackwood was back on the phone, his voice resonating with its usual authority. "No, I will accept nothing less than the full lot, and make sure the floral arrangements are discreet, yet luxurious. Nothing overdone. My guests appreciate subtle elegance." He hung up, a satisfied smile. The broken vase incident had been a momentary annoyance, quickly swept under the rug of his mind like any other imperfection. He walked to the window, observing the garden, and his eyes briefly landed on the sill where the raven usually perched. "Insolent bird," he grumbled, without real conviction, more from habit than anger. His mind was already on the night's profits. Outside, perched on the rooftop, Corvus watched. Its black, piercing eyes had caught every detail of the scene in the gallery. Ilara's violent cough, the tremor of her body, the panic in her eyes upon seeing the stain on the handkerchief. The raven's cold intelligence processed the information. The previous signs had been ignored. The button, the vase, mere distractions for Arthur. The scream it had planned needed to be more direct, more visceral, something that couldn't be dismissed as a simple accident or annoyance. With a silent and determined flight, Corvus descended from the rooftop. It landed on the sill of the art gallery window, where Ilara, exhausted, had dropped the stained silk handkerchief, forgotten in her pain. With a surgeon's precision, the raven picked up the handkerchief in its beak. It was light, but it carried the weight of truth. Next, Corvus flew directly to Arthur's study, whose window was still open. Arthur was seated at his large mahogany desk, reviewing important documents that were to be signed that night. His attention was entirely focused on the numbers and clauses. With a swift and almost imperceptible movement, Corvus entered the study. It swooped past Arthur's head, who barely felt the displacement of air. Before the man could react, the raven dropped the silk handkerchief. The fabric, soft and light, fell with a gentle whisper, landing directly on the documents Arthur was reading, right in the center of a crucial page. Arthur Blackwood blinked, confused. His eyes, previously fixed on the fine print, were now caught on the crumpled piece of silk. He picked it up with 2 fingers, an expression of distaste beginning to form on his face. The handkerchief was damp and crumpled, and the pale stain, though discreet, was visible against the white of the paper. "What is this?" he murmured, his voice laden with irritation. He recognized the handkerchief as one Ilara used. The scent of a soft floral perfume, mixed with a faint metallic odor he couldn't identify, hit his nostrils. A wrinkle of revulsion creased his forehead. "Ilara, how careless, leaving your dirty things scattered around." He was about to throw the handkerchief into the wastebasket when his eyes, for an instant, lingered on the stain. It wasn't ordinary dirt. There was something more, something that made him hesitate. A pang of discomfort, a fleeting glimpse of something he preferred to ignore, pierced his indifference, but he quickly suppressed it. "She needs to be more careful," he thought, with a tone of reprimand. Outside, on the windowsill, Corvus watched. It had seen the revulsion, the irritation, but also the brief hesitation. The moment Arthur almost understood. It wasn't the complete truth, it wasn't the devastating confrontation, but it was a step. The dirty handkerchief, the pale stain. It was a scream, more audible than any other. Arthur had felt the touch of his daughter's illness, even if he had interpreted it as carelessness. The raven knew that the seed of doubt had been planted more deeply this time. Arthur's indifference was a fortress, but Corvus was determined to tear it down, stone by stone. The next step, it knew, would be the final blow, one that would leave no room for interpretation. The herald of truth was only beginning its work. Ilara lay on the cold floor of the gallery, the stained handkerchief forgotten. Darkness danced in her vision, and the air seemed to have turned to lead, heavy and impossible to breathe. Every muscle ached, every fiber of her being cried out for rest, for relief. She tried to stand, but her arms trembled uncontrollably, and her legs gave way. The world spun, and she closed her eyes, wishing unconsciousness would carry her away from the pain, the manner, the indifference. A faint moan escaped her lips, almost inaudible in the oppressive silence of the vast room. The fever consumed her, and she felt her body draining away like a candle slowly flickering out. Outside, Corvus missed not a single detail. From the rooftop, it had seen Ilara fall, seen the fragility of her body, the surrender in her eyes. The handkerchief had planted a seed, but the scene unfolding in the gallery was irrefutable proof that the seed needed a catalyst, something that would force Arthur to see not just carelessness, but illness, negligence. With a determined flight, Corvus descended from the rooftop and landed on the sill of Ilara's bedroom window. The window was slightly ajar, allowing the raven to slip inside with ease. The room was a reflection of Ilara's soul, simple, almost Spartan, in stark contrast to the ostentatious luxury of the rest of the manor. On the bedside table, beside an untouched glass of water, lay a small glass vial. It was her medicine bottle, what she took to control her cough and fever. And it was empty, completely empty. Corvus observed it. It remembered Ilara holding it, the hope in her eyes when she took it. Now it was just a hollow shell, a silent testament to an unmet need. With its strong, precise beak, the raven picked up the vial. It was heavier than the handkerchief, more substantial, and its gentle clinking in the raven's beak sounded like a funeral bell. Meanwhile, in his study, Arthur Blackwood was in a frenzy of activity. The guests would arrive soon. He had discarded Ilara's handkerchief with a sigh of impatience, the brief pang of discomfort quickly replaced by irritation at the disarray. "She really needs to learn to be more responsible," he murmured, adjusting his tie knot. He was about to leave to inspect the dining room when a sound made him stop. A soft clinking, followed by a muffled thud, came from the desk. Arthur turned, irritated. What in the... On the documents he had just reviewed, right in the center of the main page, lay the empty glass vial. The small object rolled slightly, stopping mouth up like a silent scream. Arthur Blackwood frowned. He recognized the vial. It was Ilara's medicine. He had seen it before, occasionally when she had a cold, as he liked to downplay it. But now it was empty, completely empty. His eyes widened. The clinking of the glass, the thud, the silence that followed, everything seemed amplified. He reached out, trembling slightly, and picked up the vial. It was light, cold. He turned it over, and the label, a little faded, showed Ilara's name and the dosage. Arthur's indifference, previously an impenetrable armor, began to crack. The image of the stained handkerchief, which he had dismissed as carelessness, returned with disturbing clarity. The metallic scent he hadn't been able to identify. Ilara's cough, which he had ignored, attributing it to the weather. He looked at the empty vial in his hand, then at the open window, where Corvus had disappeared. There was no anger now, Only a growing emptiness in his stomach, a coldness that didn't come from the air conditioning, began to spread through his chest. "Empty," he whispered, his voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. But shouldn't she have more? A wave of panic began to rise. It was no longer an irritating bird, nor a mere oversight. It was an empty medicine bottle, his daughter's, who was ill, and he had ignored it. The fortress of his indifference crumbled. Images of Ilara, pale, thin, hunched over herself, which he had conveniently erased from his mind, now returned with overwhelming force. He remembered the last time he had seen her, her face sweaty, her eyes sunken. He had thought she was just tired. But what if it wasn't just tiredness? Arthur Blackwood felt a knot in his throat. The empty vial was a silent accusation, irrefutable testimony to his negligence. The truth, which he had strived so hard to keep at bay, now confronted him brutally and undeniably. The raven had not merely delivered an object, it had delivered reality, and that reality was devastating. He dropped the vial onto the desk with a dull thud, and his eyes, previously so focused on profits and power, were now fixed on the emptiness, on the absence. A chill ran down his spine. The manor, once a symbol of his success, now seemed a cold, silent mausoleum. And the truth was, he was the gravedigger. Outside on the rooftop, Corvus watched. The seed was no longer a seed, it was a tree, and its roots were deepening into Arthur Blackwood's stony heart. The work of the Herald of Truth was far from over, but the first fatal blow had been struck. Indifference had been broken. What would follow would be the confrontation with guilt. Arthur Blackwood felt the ground give way beneath his feet. The empty vial in his hand, once a harmless object, now weighed like a stone, a hammer striking his conscience. "Empty," he repeated, the word a hollow echo in his once imposing study. The image of Ilara, pale and fragile, which he had so diligently pushed into the darkest corners of his mind, erupted with overwhelming ferocity. He remembered every cough he had ignored, every complaint of tiredness he had minimized as feminine laziness, the fever he had attributed to a persistent cold, the paleness he had dismissed as lack of sun. The metallic scent on the silk handkerchief, which he had discarded as dirt, now revealed itself as the bittersweet odor of blood, of illness. Every one of his excuses, every one of his rationalizations crumbled like a house of cards. "No, it can't be," he murmured, his voice choked. A wave of nausea rose in his throat. He wasn't just ignoring a cold, he was ignoring his daughter, his own daughter. The ambition, the power, the profits he so valued, all seemed futile, insignificant before that small, empty bottle. It was a silent testament to an urgent need, to prolonged suffering, to a life he was allowing to slip through his fingers. The panic, previously a distant chill, now transformed into an uncontrollable fire in his chest. He dropped the vial onto the desk with a dull thud, the sound reverberating in his ears like a gunshot. His eyes swept the study, once a sanctuary of his success, now a stage for his monumental failure. The manor, with its marble walls and crystal chandeliers, seemed to mock him, each luxury a reminder of his indifference. "Ilara," he cried, but the sound was hoarse, almost inaudible. There was no answer. The silence of the house was an even more potent accusation. He needed to see her. He needed to know. With trembling legs, Arthur rose from his chair. The tie he had adjusted moments before now seemed to tighten around his throat. He rushed to the door, his mind a whirlwind of images. Ilara hunched on the floor, her violent cough, her sunken eyes. He had seen everything but had refused to see. The raven's head was slightly tilted, its black eyes fixed on Arthur's stumbling figure. The Herald of Truth felt a grim satisfaction. The blow had been struck. The fortress of indifference had yielded, and the man who considered himself invincible was now at the mercy of his own guilt. The work was not finished, but the path to truth was open. Arthur descended the main staircase, his footsteps echoing in the vast manor. He ignored the party preparations, the hurrying servants, the floral arrangements. His eyes searched for Elara, his mind repeating the same question. Where is she? Where is she? He rushed through the living room, through the library, his heart pounding erratically. Finally, he reached the art gallery. The late afternoon light filtered through the tall windows, painting the marble floor with golden and purple hues. And there, amidst that cold and indifferent splendor, lay Elara. She was lying on the floor, a small, fragile figure, curled in on herself. Her body trembled uncontrollably, and cold sweat covered her forehead. Her face, once so vibrant, was pale and marked by pain. Her lips cracked, her eyes half closed. A dark, damp stain spread across the light marble beneath her head, a shocking contrast to the beauty of the artworks around her. Arthur stopped abruptly, as if he had received an electric shock. The air seemed to thin, and the world around him fell silent. The sight of his daughter, so helpless, so on the brink of the abyss, struck him with the force of lightning. It wasn't a cold, it wasn't tiredness, it was much worse. "Elara," he whispered, his voice failing. He rushed to her, falling to his knees beside her. His fingers trembled as he touched the cold, damp skin of her forehead. The fever was scorching, but her body was icy. "Father," she murmured, her voice almost inaudible, a faint thread of sound. Her eyes opened slightly, but there was no recognition, only a haze of pain and exhaustion. Arthur felt a knot in his throat, a sharp, unbearable pain that had nothing to do with ambition or money. It was the pain of guilt, of remorse, of the love he had buried under layers of indifference. He picked her up in his arms, feeling the light, fragile weight of her body. She was so small, so vulnerable. "Elara, my daughter, what have I done?" he sobbed, tears welling in his eyes, the first in years. The manor, once a symbol of his power, was now a tomb for his own humanity. He had failed, and the price of his failure lay there, dying in his arms. The confrontation had arrived. The father who had refused to see now held the truth in his arms. The work of the Herald of Truth was only beginning to reveal its darkest consequences. The dark stain on the marble, which before seemed only a shadow, now revealed itself in its terrible clarity. A deep red, almost brown, slowly spreading. The metallic scent he had noticed on the handkerchief was now unmistakable. Blood. Terror chilled his veins. "Elara, speak to me, please," he pleaded, his voice choked with panic. He rocked her gently, but she remained limp in his arms, her eyes still half closed, her breathing shallow and irregular. The cold sweat on her forehead was a dark omen. Arthur lifted his head, his eyes sweeping the vast gallery, previously so full of art and now a scene of despair. "Someone, please, help!" he cried, his voice hoarse, almost a lament. His cry echoed through the marble walls, a dissonant sound in the silent opulence. Within seconds, the butler, Mr. Davies, and some servants who were in the final preparations for the party rushed into the gallery, drawn by the distressed sound. Their faces, previously focused on their tasks, now contorted in shock and horror upon seeing the scene. "Mr. Blackwood, what happened?" exclaimed Davies, rushing to them, his face pale. He had seen Elara's deterioration, but Arthur had forbidden any interference. "It's Elara. She's very ill. Call a doctor. An ambulance. Now!" Arthur ordered, his voice trembling. He could barely form the words. "Quickly, Davies, please!" Davies, a middle-aged man with years of service to the family, didn't hesitate. "Yes, sir. Immediately." He turned to the other servants. "You, bring blankets, water, and call emergency services. Tell them it's a critical situation." As the servants hurried, Arthur held Elara tightly against him. He felt the feverish heat of her body, contrasting with the coldness of her extremities. Each of her breaths was a visible effort, a small moan escaping her cracked lips. He kissed her forehead, feeling the salt of his own tears mix with her sweat. "My daughter, forgive me. Please, forgive me," he whispered repeatedly, the words lost in the air. Images of his indifference, of his cruel words, of his distorted priorities haunted him like ghosts. He had traded his daughter's life for business meetings and gala dinners. He had traded his love for an empty empire. The manor, which was once the stage for his grandeur, now seemed like a monster devouring him. Every artwork, every piece of luxurious furniture, every inch of polished marble seemed to mock his blindness. The wealth he had accumulated was useless now, unable to buy a single moment of health for his daughter. Davies returned, his phone still in hand. "The ambulance is on its way, sir. They said not to move her, just keep her warm." He handed a soft blanket to Arthur, who carefully wrapped it around Ilara. Arthur looked at Ilara's pale and marked face, at the dark stain on the floor, at the empty medicine vial that was still on his desk, everything connected in a web of negligence and guilt. The raven, the signs, the handkerchief, the vial. He had been warned repeatedly and had refused to listen. Outside, perched on the rooftop, Corvus observed the commotion in the gallery. The sound of Arthur's cries, the scurrying of the servants, the palpable despair, its black, deep and intelligent eyes fixed on Arthur's figure, hunched over his daughter. The truth, finally, had manifested undeniably. The herald of truth had fulfilled its part. Now the man would have to face the consequences of his own cruelty. Justice, though late, was beginning to unfold. The distant sound of a siren, previously muffled by the vastness of the manor, began to grow, cutting through the opulent silence with a shrill urgency. Arthur barely registered the sound. His eyes were fixed on Ilara, her breathing weak and irregular. He continued to murmur apologies, kissing her feverish forehead, feeling the unbearable weight of his negligence. Within minutes, the manor's main door burst open, and two paramedics, followed by two technicians, entered hurriedly, carrying a stretcher and an array of equipment. Mr. Davies quickly guided them to the gallery, where the scene unfolded. The sight of Ilara, so small and fragile, lying on the marble floor with the dark stain beside her, made the healthcare professionals act with immediate gravity. "Sir, we need you to step back a little so we can examine her," said one of the paramedics, a woman with a serious face and efficient movements. Arthur hesitated, reluctant to let go of his daughter. But the urgency in her voice made him yield. He moved back just enough for them to work, but remained kneeling, his hands trembling, his eyes fixed on every movement. The paramedics acted with speed and precision. One checked Ilara's pulse, the other placed an oximeter on her finger and a stethoscope on her chest. The silence in the gallery was broken only by the technical murmurs of the paramedics and Arthur's ragged breathing. "Weak and rapid pulse, low saturation, high fever," said the paramedic, her eyes meeting Arthur's for an instant. There was no judgment, only the cold assessment of a professional. "She is dehydrated and has severe respiratory distress. There appears to be internal bleeding." The word bleeding hit Arthur like a physical blow. The empty medicine vial, the stain on the handkerchief, the now unmistakable stain on the marble, everything fit into a picture of horror. She'll be all right, won't she?" Arthur asked, his voice hoarse, almost pleading. The male paramedic applied an oxygen mask to Ilara's face. "We're taking her to the hospital immediately, sir. She needs urgent medical attention." They carefully moved her to the stretcher, covering her with a thermal blanket. Arthur watched every movement, feeling helpless and useless. He had built an empire, but he couldn't protect his own daughter. "I'm going with her," Arthur declared, standing up on still shaky legs. "Yes, sir." "Please follow us," said the paramedic, as they began to move the stretcher towards the exit. As Ilara was carried through the gallery, under the shocked and silent gazes of the servants, Arthur felt an icy emptiness in his chest. The manor, once a refuge of his grandeur, was now a monument to his failure. Every artwork, every piece of luxurious furniture seemed to mock his blindness. He followed the stretcher, his eyes fixed on Ilara's pale face, the oxygen mask fogged by her weak breathing. Mr. Davies, his face contorted in a mixture of concern and relief that action was finally being taken, opened the main doors. The ambulance siren, now loud and clear, filled the night air. The vehicle's intermittent light painted the manor walls with blue and red flashes, a macabre dance on the imposing facade. Curious neighbors, drawn by the noise, peered from behind their fences, witnessing the unusual scene. The paramedics carried Ilara into the ambulance. Arthur tried to get in, but was stopped by one of the technicians. "Sir, it's better if you go in your car. We need space to work in here." Arthur nodded, stunned. He watched the ambulance door close, the vehicle pulling away with a screech of tires, its lights flashing and siren rapidly fading into the darkness. He stood there, in the middle of the manor's entrance, the cold night wind hitting his face. The bloodstain in the gallery, the empty medicine vial on his desk, Corvus's gaze, everything connected in a web of negligence and guilt. Outside, perched on the rooftop, Corvus watched the ambulance disappear into the distance, its black, deep and intelligent eyes fixed on Arthur's figure, hunched and desolate at the manor's entrance. Now, the man would have to face the consequences of his own cruelty, and the Raven knew that Arthur's journey through guilt and remorse was only beginning. Justice, though late, was on its way. Arthur stood there, in the middle of the manor's entrance, the cold night wind hitting his face. The silence that followed the ambulance's departure was more deafening than any siren. The manor's opulence, once a shield against the world, now seemed a prison of his own making. He looked up at the dark rooftop, and for an instant swore he saw Corvus's silhouette, motionless, watching him. A pang of anger mixed with icy terror shot through him. The Raven had been the herald, the messenger of a truth he refused to hear. "Mr. Blackwood, are you all right?" Mr. Davies's voice pulled him from his stupor. The butler stood beside him, his face still pale, but with a silent determination. "We should go to the hospital. I can call your car for you." Arthur slowly shook his head, as if waking from a nightmare. "No, I'll drive. I need a moment." He didn't want anyone to see him in his state of despair. The image of himself, a man of power and control, crumbling in front of his servants, was unbearable. Davies nodded, understanding his employer's need for solitude, or perhaps his shame. "As you wish, sir. I'll be here if you need anything." He withdrew discreetly, leaving Arthur alone in the vastness of the entrance. Arthur walked back inside the manor, his footsteps echoing hollowly on the marble. The gallery, previously the stage for his imminent party, was now a scene of desolation. The dark stain on the floor, though already being cleaned by one of the servants, seemed indelible in his mind. He saw the empty medicine vial still on his desk, a monument to his negligence. He sat down heavily in one of the ornate chairs, his head in his hands. Images of Ilara, pale and fragile, the paramedic's words, internal bleeding, critical condition, spun in his mind like a macabre carousel. Every moment he had ignored her, every time he had prioritized his business, every time he had told himself she was just being dramatic, now hit him with the force of a hammer. "My God, what have I done?" he whispered into the emptiness of the manor. The wealth he so valued, the empire he had built, all seemed a cruel joke now. He had traded his daughter's life for a legacy of stone and paper. With an immense effort, he stood up. There was no time for self-pity. Ilara needed him. He needed to be there. He picked up his car keys, his hand trembling so much he could barely hold them. On the way to the hospital, the night city was a blur. He drove too fast, ignoring speed limits. the streetlights merging into a tunnel of light and shadow. His mind was a whirlwind. He thought of Ilara's eyes, always so full of a silent sadness, of her small gestures of tiredness that he had deliberately ignored. He thought of the raven, of its intelligent eyes, of how the animal had tried in its own way to warn him. He had scoffed at the raven, at the idea that a bird could possess more compassion than he. The irony was a bitter poison in his throat. Upon arriving at the hospital, the modern, cold architecture contrasted brutally with the opulence of his manor. The smell of antiseptic and the fluorescent light of the emergency room hit him like a shock. The receptionist, a middle-aged woman with a tired face, looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and indifference. "I'm here for my daughter, Ilara Blackwood. She just arrived by ambulance," Arthur said, his voice hoarse, almost unrecognizable. The receptionist typed on the computer. "Ah, yes. She's being evaluated. You can wait in the waiting room. A doctor will come speak with you as soon as possible." The waiting room was a purgatory of plastic chairs and old magazines. People with worried faces, some coughing, others with empty stares. Arthur, accustomed to luxurious meeting rooms and exclusive dinners, felt completely out of place, a fish out of water. He was just another frightened father, waiting for news of his daughter, and guilt, heavy and suffocating, was his only companion. Outside, perched in a tall tree outside the hospital, Corvus watched the emergency lights. Its black, deep and intelligent eyes seemed to see beyond the brick walls, to the drama unfolding within. The truth had been revealed. The man had been forced to confront his cruelty. But the raven knew that Arthur's journey through guilt and remorse was only beginning, and Ilara's fate still hung in the balance, a direct consequence of an indifference that almost cost a life. Justice, though late, was on its way, but its cost was immense. The silence in the waiting room was a torment. Every tick-tock of the clock on the wall, every muffled cough from another patient, every creak of a plastic chair was amplified in Arthur's mind. He was there, a man accustomed to commanding boardrooms and dictating the pace of empires, reduced to an insignificant figure in a corner, at the mercy of a fate he himself had forged. The fluorescent lights hummed, bathing everything in a cold, impersonal clarity that contrasted brutally with the golden warmth of his manner. The smell of disinfectant and illness permeated the air, a constant reminder of the fragility of life he had so arrogantly ignored. He tried to focus, but his mind was a whirlwind of images and sounds. Ilara's pale face on the stretcher, the sound of the siren fading away, the empty medicine vial, the dark stain on the marble, and above all, Corvus's eyes, fixed on him, a silent judgment that now reverberated in every fiber of his being. He had scoffed at the raven, at the idea that an animal could possess more wisdom than he. Now the irony was a bitter poison in his throat. "Mr. Blackwood?" The voice came suddenly, soft, yet firm, pulling him from his trance. A man in a white coat, with thin glasses and a serious expression, stood before him. It was Dr. Elias Vance, the attending physician. Arthur rose with a start, his legs still shaky. "Yes, that's me. How is my daughter, Ilara?" Dr. Vance gestured for him to sit down again, and Arthur obeyed, his heart pounding erratically. The doctor sat in the chair opposite him, elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped. His posture conveyed a gravity that made Arthur's stomach clench. "Mr. Blackwood, your daughter Ilara is in serious condition," Dr. Vance began, his voice calm yet direct. "She arrived with severe dehydration, high fever, and respiratory distress. Our preliminary tests indicate significant internal hemorrhage, likely in the gastrointestinal tract, which caused acute anemia." The word hemorrhage echoed in Arthur's mind, confirming his worst fears. He remembered the stain on the handkerchief, the stain on the marble, the empty medicine vial. She also has advanced pulmonary infection, which appears to have been neglected for a considerable time. The doctor continued, his eyes fixed on Arthur's. There was no accusation in his gaze, only the cold statement of facts, which was far worse than any reprimand. We are doing our utmost to stabilize her. She required an immediate blood transfusion, and we are administering potent antibiotics for the infection. The surgical team is evaluating the need for intervention to control the bleeding. Arthur felt the air thin in his lungs. Neglected. For how long? He managed to whisper, his voice almost inaudible. Dr. Vance sighed. It's difficult to say precisely, but the signs of malnutrition and the progression of the infection suggest she hasn't received adequate care for weeks, perhaps months. Her body is extremely debilitated. Months, weeks. Ilara's voice, thin and fragile, asking to rest, her tired eyes, the cough he had ignored, attributing it to a persistent cold. Each memory was a stab. He had forced his ailing daughter to clean an immense manor day after day, while she wasted away. He had traded her life for his own ambition. She. Will she survive? Arthur asked, his voice choked, his eyes welling up. The image of the empire he had built, of his wealth and power, crumbled before the impotence of his own being. Dr. Vance hesitated for a moment. We are doing everything within our power, Mr. Blackwood, but her condition is critical. The next 24 to 48 hours will be decisive. She is in the ICU. You can see her for a few minutes if you wish, but you must be brief. Arthur nodded, unable to speak. He stood up, swaying slightly, and followed Dr. Vance through the cold, silent corridors of the hospital. Each step was a penance, each fluorescent light a spotlight on his guilt. He had built an empire, but he had destroyed his own family. The wealth he so valued was useless now, unable to buy a single moment of health for his daughter or to erase the indelible stain of his cruelty. Justice, though late, was on its way, but its cost was immense, and Arthur's pain was only the beginning of the payment. Arthur followed Dr. Vance in a sepulchral silence. The hospital corridors seemed like endless labyrinths, each turn revealing more of that sterile and impersonal atmosphere. The smell of disinfectant was stronger here, mixed with a faint metallic odor that Arthur couldn't identify, but which made him feel nauseous. The fluorescent lights reflected on the polished floor, creating a cold glare that seemed to suck all color and warmth from the world. Finally, they stopped before a glass door. Dr. Vance gestured, and Arthur peered inside. The sight hit him like a punch to the gut. Ilara was there, lying in a bed that seemed too large for her diminutive body. Her face was pale, almost translucent, and her lips, once so thin and delicate, were now cracked and dry. A series of tubes and wires emerged from her fragile body, connecting her to machines that hummed and beeped softly. A breathing tube was in her mouth, and an oxygen mask covered part of her face. Her eyes were closed, and she seemed so small, so helpless, that Arthur felt the air catch in his throat. He barely recognized her. It wasn't the Ilara he had last seen, even if sick and tired. That was a shadow, an almost empty shell of his daughter. Dr. Vance opened the door and gestured for him to enter. Just for a few minutes, Mr. Blackwood. She needs absolute rest. Arthur entered, his steps heavy and hesitant on the vinyl floor. The sound of the heart and respiratory monitors was the only noise in the room, a constant rhythm that seemed to mock the deafening silence of his own conscience. He approached the bed, feeling the weight of each step, as if he were walking on broken glass. He stopped beside her, looking at his daughter's face. The deep circles under her closed eyes, the thin layer of sweat on her forehead, the slight tremor in her eyelids. He reached out, hesitant, and touched her cold fingertips. Her skin was icy, almost lifeless. "Ilara," he whispered, his voice hoarse and choked. The sound of her own name, in an almost inaudible whisper, seemed a sacrilege in the ICU's silence. "My daughter." A solitary tear ran down his face, warm and salty, a brutal contrast to the coldness of the room and Ilara's skin. He had ignored her pleas, her coughs, her tiredness. He had forced her to work day after day while she wasted away. He had prioritized his manor, his empire, his own image above the life of his only daughter. The image of the raven, Corvus, came to his mind. The bird he had despised, which he had considered a mere nuisance, had tried to warn him. It had brought the empty medicine vial, a silent cry for help, and he had been too blind to see, too deaf to hear. The irony was a bitter poison in his throat, burning him from within. "I'm so sorry, Ilara," he whispered again, the words lost in the hum of the machines. "I'm so sorry for everything. I was a fool. A monster." He wanted to scream, wanted to kneel and beg for forgiveness, but the words wouldn't come, caught in a knot of guilt and despair. He was Arthur Blackwood, the man who had everything, and now had nothing but the impending loss of his daughter, a loss he himself had orchestrated. Dr. Vance approached, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Mr. Blackwood, we need to let her rest now. The nursing staff needs to do a round." Arthur nodded, unable to tear his gaze from Ilara's face. He wanted to stay there forever, to try to make up somehow for the months of neglect. But he knew he couldn't. He was an intruder there, a painful reminder of his own failure. With one last look at his daughter, he turned and left the room, his heart heavy as lead. Each step away from her was torture, each sound of the machines an echo of his own cruelty. It had seen the pain in the man's eyes, the crushing guilt. It was a good start, but the Raven knew that the path to redemption was long and uncertain, and time for Ilara was a luxury they might not have. Outside the room, Dr. Vance led him to a small waiting area. "Mr. Blackwood, I understand this is a moment of great anguish, but it's crucial that you remain strong for Ilara." Arthur sank into a plastic chair, his body trembling. "Strong. I'm the reason she's like this. I killed her, Dr. Vance, slowly." The doctor sighed, sitting opposite him. "This is not the time for self-flagellation, Mr. Blackwood. It's time to act. Your daughter needs all the strength you can muster. The medical team will do the impossible, but family support is vital. You can stay here if you wish. There's a family lounge." "I want to stay," Arthur said. His voice choked. "I'm not leaving here, not until she's well. If she's not well, neither will I be." He looked at the doctor, his eyes red and swollen. "Is there anything else I can do? Money? Anything? I have unlimited resources. I can bring in the best specialists in the world." Dr. Vance looked at him with tired compassion. "Mr. Blackwood, we are doing our very best. Medicine has its limits. What Ilara needs now is time, her own strength to fight, and an environment of peace and hope. Your money cannot buy that." The raw truth hit Arthur with the force of lightning. His empire, his wealth, everything he had valued, was useless, incapable of healing, incapable of buying forgiveness, incapable of reversing time. He was just a father who had failed miserably. Arthur Blackwood remained in the plastic chair, his body still trembling, but now with a new kind of despair. Dr. Vance's words echoed in his mind. "Your money cannot buy that." It was a brutal truth, a sentence that dismantled his entire existence. He, Arthur Blackwood, the man who moved mountains with his fortune, was powerless. For the first time in his life, the power of money was useless, and the feeling was more paralyzing than any financial bankruptcy. He closed his eyes, and the image of Ilara, small and fragile in the ICU bed, burned behind his eyelids. The breathing tube, the wires, the deathly pallor. It wasn't the Ilara he knew. It wasn't even the sick Ilara he had ignored. It was a shadow, a ghost of his daughter, on the verge of disappearing completely. "I need to do something," he murmured to himself, his voice hoarse. "But what?" Dr. Vance had been clear. There were no specialists money could buy who weren't already there, no secret treatment that could reverse months of neglect. There was only the waiting, the uncertainty, and the crushing guilt. Dr. Vance, sensing Arthur's silent collapse, sat down again. "Mr. Blackwood, I know it's difficult, but the best thing you can do now is take care of yourself. Ilara will need your strength when she wakes up." Arthur opened his eyes, fixing them on the doctor. "If she wakes up." The phrase hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The doctor sighed. "We are doing everything we can. She is young, and that works in her favor. But the road ahead will be long, and you will need to be present, lucid." He paused, assessing the broken man before him. "There's a small cafeteria on the ground floor. You should eat something, drink water, and try to rest, even if for a few minutes." Arthur shook his head. I can't eat. I can't rest. Not while she's in there." He pointed to the ICU door, as if the door itself were an insurmountable barrier between him and redemption. "I need to be here, near her." "All right," said Dr. Vance with an understanding Arthur didn't deserve. "But try to stay hydrated. I'll ask a nurse to bring you a bottle of water." The doctor stood up, leaving Arthur alone again with his demons. The waiting room was a purgatory. The bright, impersonal walls seemed to mock his troubled soul. He picked up his cell phone but didn't know whom to call. His contacts were all business-related, people who only cared about the Blackwood Empire. No one to share this pain, no one to offer genuine solace. He was alone, and he deserved to be. The image of the raven, Corvus, returned with force. The bird he had tried to drive away, the animal he had despised as a pest, was the only one who had tried to save her. Corvus, with its dark intelligence and unwavering loyalty, had seen what Arthur refused to see. The empty medicine vial, a mute testament to his cruelty. "Corvus," he whispered, the bird's name sounding strange on his lips. A pang of shame hit him. He had been so arrogant, so blind. The raven was Ilara's true guardian, not him. Hours dragged on. The nurse brought the water, which Arthur drank mechanically. He refused to leave that chair, as if his immobility could somehow compensate for his past inaction. Every minute was torture, every sound of the hospital a reminder of the fragility of life and the irreversibility of his choices. Outside, the night wore on, and the emergency lights continued to shine, a beacon of hope and despair. Corvus, perched in its tree, had not moved. Its black eyes, sharper than ever, watched the waiting room window where Arthur sat. It saw the man's hunched figure, his head in his hands, the image of an empire in ruins. The raven felt no satisfaction in Arthur's pain, only a deep and ancient wisdom. Justice was being served, but it was not a justice of vengeance, but of consequence. Arthur's suffering was the price of his indifference, a payment he would have to make in every minute of waiting, in every beat of his daughter's heart that he had almost silenced. Corvus knew that Ilara's struggle was not yet over, and that Arthur's redemption was an arduous and uncertain path. But the seed had been planted, the truth had been revealed, and the man had been broken. Now, time would tell if from this ruin something new could be born, something worthy of the life he almost destroyed. The raven watched, patient and vigilant, the silent guardian of a faint hope. Dawn arrived, not with the promise of a new day, but with the cold reality of time that could not be undone. The hospital lights, previously an intense glow in the darkness, now seemed pale under the grey dawn, peering through the windows. Arthur was still in the same chair, his muscles stiff, his mind a battlefield. He hadn't slept, hadn't eaten. The water bottle beside him was empty, a small trophy of his obstinacy. His eyes, red and swollen, fixed on the ICU door. Every fibre of his being yearned for news, but at the same time feared what it might bring. The image of Ilara, so vivid in his mind, was a constant torment. He saw her coughing as she cleaned the cold marble floor, the paleness in her face he had attributed to laziness, the tiredness in her eyes he had ignored. Each memory was a stab, each neglect a blow he had dealt against his own daughter. "Elara, my little Elara," he whispered, his voice hoarse from disuse. He remembered when she was a child, full of life, running through the manor gardens, her laughter echoing through the corridors. Where was that girl now? He had suffocated her with his ambition, imprisoned her in his indifference. The manor, once his greatest pride, was now a monument to his cruelty. He imagined the silence that now hung over it, the dust accumulating, no longer cleaned by his daughter's fragile hand. The irony was overwhelming. A nurse passed by, stopping briefly. "Mr. Blackwood, there are no changes in Miss Elara's condition. The team is doing its best." Her voice was gentle, but the words were an empty echo. "Shouldn't you try to rest a little? We have a family lounge." Arthur shook his head, his eyes fixed on the door. "No, I need to be here." Hours turned into a new day. Dr. Vance reappeared, his face tired, but with a glimmer of determination. "Mr. Blackwood, Elara is stable. There has been no worsening, which is a good sign. But it's still too early for any definitive prognosis." He paused, looking at Arthur with renewed seriousness. "We still have a long road ahead. She will need intensive care for a while. And when she wakes up, the recovery will be slow and will require much patience and support." Arthur, for the first time in a long time, felt a pang of something that wasn't guilt or despair. It was a spark, a promise. "I'll be here," he said, his voice firmer than before. "I'm going to be here for her, for every step." He stood up swaying and walked to the ICU door. He didn't open it, but touched the cold surface with his palm as if he could feel Elara's presence through it. "I failed you, my daughter," he whispered, tears streaming freely down his face. "But I swear I'm going to fix it. I'm going to be the father you deserve. I'm going to take care of you. No matter what happens, I'm going to be here." Outside, Corvus, from high in its tree, observed Arthur's gesture. Its black eyes, which had witnessed so much pain and indifference, now seemed to catch a new light. The man was no longer broken by the pain of impending loss, but rather forged by a new resolution. The seed had germinated, the truth had been revealed, and the man, though still in ruins, began to glimpse the possibility of rebuilding. The raven did not fly away. It remained perched, a dark speck against the sky that now opened into a clearer blue. Justice was not an end, but a beginning. Arthur's redemption would be an arduous path, paved with regret and dedication. Elara's recovery, a daily battle for life. But hope, previously as tenuous as a silk thread, now showed itself a little stronger, woven by the promise of a father who had finally found his way back. Corvus, the silent guardian, knew its vigil was not over. It would continue to watch, a dark and constant reminder that life, in its fragility and resilience, always finds a way, even in the ashes of the deepest tragedy. The story of Arthur and Elara had no period, but a new and uncertain chapter where love and redemption would fight to blossom.